Making a Killing, Sadie's Story and the Schiller Scam. And it's page 353. Told in the words of a pretty 21-year-old who calmly confessed to the most hideous crime of the century from the cover of The Killing of Sharon Tate. That's just a quote at the beginning of the chapter. What's been lost in the confusion surrounding the Manson phenomenon is how decisive a role the extravagant stories of Susan Atkins, we are told, that she squealed in jail in early November of 1969 really played in the entire future development of the cause and legend it inspired. If the Manson myth has a mother, it's Sexy Sadie. Without her original confession, Bugliosi would have had no case, as he later admitted. And because that tale was sanctioned by a docile, unquestioning media within weeks of her indictment as a true story, almost all of the stories spun from it, including all tales told by her fellow defendants, Watson, Kasabian, and Krenwinkel, were obliged to more or less stick to the general outline of the Atkins account. Of course, to paraphrase the Beatles she so adored, Atkins' narrative was polished with more than a little help from her friends, if lawyers can be considered friends. The Manson myth's formulations began when Atkins, identifying herself as Donna Powell, was picked up by the police at the Barker Ranch on October the 9th, 1969, with her infant child, Zizo Sadfrak. Originally, Atkins was only suspected of having some possible involvement with auto theft. On October the 12th, the day of Manson's arrest, young Kitty Lutzinger, Bobby Beausoleil's pregnant girlfriend, was discovered by the police not far from the Barker Ranch. She requested law enforcement protection, claiming that she was in danger from the others in the nomadic tribe she'd been staying with. Lutzinger never felt fully trusted by the Manson circle, and she agreed to talk to detectives about her knowledge of the other crimes committed by the hippie car thieves being rounded up in the area. 2 Los Angeles homicide detectives investigating the Hinman murder since July had been looking for Lutzinger ever since they learned of her relationship with Beausoleil. When they heard that she'd surfaced, they came to interview her in the small desert town of Independence in Inyo County. In the course of telling the cops what she'd heard from the others about the Hinman murder, a since discredited tale, placing all the blame for Beausoleil's deed on Manson, Kitty mentioned that Susan Atkins had been present at the crime scene during the killings. Lutzinger, it should be recalled, had personal reasons to shift blame from Beausoleil to Manson, since she was primarily Beausoleil's girlfriend. The next day, Atkins, held in the small Independence jail, was questioned. She admitted that she was there when Beausoleil stabbed her friend Hinman. She was arrested for murder and sent to Sybil Brand Women's Detention Institute in LA. While all this was going on, police were questioning the still unindicted Leslie Van Houten, who they also had in their custody, about a tip that she had revealed in her knowledge about the Cielo Waverly murders to some others. In the course of this first questioning, Leslie said without any ambiguity that Charlie wasn't in on those. This statement was made before the Atkins confession, and the bizarre defense strategy arising is that is the source of the Manson myth. Van Houten, whose links to the Manson circle was never very deep and was also primarily one of Bobby's harem, came very close to testifying against her accomplices in exchange for immunity. It appears that Van Houten was leaning in the direction of telling something more in line with the truth about the crimes than Charlie as a mastermind story Atkins had concocted. In fact, Van Houten, despite her seeming loyalty to Manson and the other defendants in court, wavered back and forth even well into the trial. She was on the verge of cooperating with the prosecution immediately before the death of her attorney, Ronald Hughes, which made her think better of it. The conspiracy to cover up the real background of the crimes was always extremely fragile. It was in danger of being exposed until the very moment the verdicts were delivered in the courtroom. Had it been Van Houten rather than Atkins who broke the case in November 1969, it's unlikely that the cover story of of Manson ordering Helter Skelter could have been devised. While Lulu vacillated, human nature prevailed. Sadie Mae Glutz seized the first opportunity to save her own skin that she could find. What happened next can be interpreted, if you like, as an extraordinary amount of faith. Sorry, I've lost my place. The book got awkward. What happened next can be interpreted, if you like, as an incredible chain of coincidences, but only if you're endowed with an extraordinary amount of faith in the essential goodness of mankind and the ethics of the legal profession, and the complete ignorance of the influence of organised crime has always had exerted in the US justice system. If Atkins was found guilty of involvement in the Hinman killing, she faced the death penalty, according to the California law of conspiracy. She was destitute and had no family to help her with legal costs. And yet, through some unknown connection that remains obscure to this day, Her court-appointed attorney, Gerald Condon, was dismissed from the case, and the dirt-poor sexy Sadie immediately obtained the public defender services of Richard Caballero, a high-priced attorney with some very intriguing connections. He promised Atkins that if she cooperated, he could make a deal with the prosecutor that would win her a reduced sentence. While Caballero was the public face of the Atkins original defense team, a much more experienced and better-known attorney was the real brains behind the legal strategy. Caballero's associate was Paul Caruso, one of the most expensive and prominent lawyers in California. Why would someone of Caruso's stature become involved as a public defender for the unknown hippie Atkins, who couldn't have even dreamed of paying him in his usual exorbitant rate? As you will recall from the last chapter, Caruso was not only renowned for his unstinting service to the Italian-American community, but also for his proven competency defending of some of the group's shadier underworld business partners, especially clients in the narcotics trade. We need only refer to 4 of the defendants he served in 1969 alone to see how remarkable it is that Paul Caruso should happen to be one of the many attorneys helping out with Susan Atkins' defense, supposedly before her involvement with the tape murder was known. To refresh your memory, among Caruso's other young clients in the same dope-dealing demimonde which Atkins and her accomplices moved in was Tommy Harrigan. The drug dealer Harrigan, we recall, had visited Sebring and Frykowski at Cielo Drive on the day before their murders to arrange for an MDA delivery. It was Harrigan who heard Frykowski's claim that he would die young and violently. Harrigan, as detailed in Chapter 5, was part of Billy Doyle's dope-dealing clique, and a frequent guest at the same Mama Cass drug parties at Woodstock Road that Susan Atkins and Tex Watson attended. Also involved in the small world of the Doyle, Harrigan, Reinhardt, Dawson drug circle was a major cocaine dealer named Charles Tackott, along with Billy Doyle. Tackott's name appeared in the Los Angeles Times as a Cielo Drive murder suspect immediately after the story broke, when Charles Tackott lost a potential job with NBC because they didn't wish to be associated with a murder suspect. Tackott hired Paul Caruso as his lawyer. Caruso filed a suit against the Los Angeles Times, accusing the paper of damaging his drug dealer client's reputation by connecting him to the Cielo Drive murder. And it's in this regard that Caruso's name comes up in connection with Cielo Drive at an early point in the investigation. State homicide investigator Lieutenant Earl Deemer interviewed Tackott's friend and fellow suspect Billy Reinhardt at Parker Center on 30th of September 1969. Reinhardt made it clear that he knew Paul Caruso well. Reinhardt found it so peculiar that Caruso, a Los Angeles Times legal representative, was suing the paper he worked for on behalf of Tackott that he mentions it several times to Deemer. Charles Tackott is suing the Los Angeles Times. Caruso told one of his clients that Charles turned in everybody's name as a Cielo Drive murder suspect, which made this guy go to Charles and pounce on him and say, "I'm going to do you in because you turned in all of our friends' names, you know." And it seems kind of weird that Paul Caruso is the attorney for the Los Angeles Times too. Later in the interview, Reinhardt says, "Now Charles has a suit against the LA Times, and Caruso is the lawyer for the LA Times, you know." What I mean, a lot of weird things like that have come down, and I don't understand really. The lawyer's role in this episode is indeed kind of weird, especially when we consider that 3 months later, Caruso would broker the deal to the phony Atkins confession as an exclusive to his clients, the Los Angeles Times, and The Killing of Sharon Tate, a book made from those articles, was published by the New American Library, subsidiary for the Times. During the September 1969 interview, Billy Reinhardt also told Deemer that Caruso was well versed on details of the Cielo Drive crime scene and that the police had not yet released. This is from Caruso that they had already found fingerprints and footprints at the murder site and that the gun was a small caliber gun. Susan Atkins had not ever been arrested yet at this juncture. Why, a month after the murders, did her future lawyers have an interest in the inside knowledge of the crime his future client would be charged with? Again, it must be emphasized that the lawyer helping to prepare Atkins' defense was not only directly involved with at least 2 of the original Cielo Drive suspects, and the newspaper most responsible for providing the public with false information on the crime. Among the many mob clients Caruso represented was Eugene Massaro, whose sidekick Joel Rosdale's presence at Cielo Drive the night before the murders was of course one of the main factors the cover-up sought to conceal. This list of clients is incriminating enough, but when we consider that Atkins' original statement, the first tentative trickle of the flood of bullshit that would soon become Bugliosi's helter-skelter, was made while she was being represented by Paul Caruso, It becomes almost impossible to believe that his placement on her defense team is just an amazing manifestation of chance. Richard Caballero was the public face of her original defense team, but Caruso's well-documented presence at several of Caballero-Atkins' conferences makes it clear that the better-connected attorney for the mob consistently provided counsel on her case. This was the same strategy her old friend Sidney Korshak utilised when guiding the legal strategy of his own underworld clients. Korshak discreetly directed the defence for his crook clients from behind the scenes, allowing attorneys less openly connected to the mob to be the frontmen for his operations. Considering what we know of the jetlag Polanski-Gutowski-Evans damage control meeting with the fixer Korshak at Paramount Studios one day after the Cielo Drive murders, it's not too far-fetched to suspect that like a Russian matryoshka doll's many layers of nested dolls of diminishing size placed within another, just as Caruso stood behind Caballero, so did Korshak stand behind Caruso. We will never know which higher-up of the mob's Hollywood drug dealer chain of command decided that Atkins should be given the order to confess by telling a story which conveniently deleted all of the details the mafia wanted to keep from public scrutiny. Many years later, Atkins only spoke vaguely of being given a tip shortly after arriving in Los Angeles from Death Valley that the word was that the cops knew she was involved with the Cielo Drive slaughter. If she wanted a deal to avoid the gas chamber, this as yet unidentified advisor assured her something could be arranged. The mob's elaborate system of buffers and cutouts is designed to prevent just such knowledge from becoming known to its pawns. In the vulnerable legal situation Atkins was in, little persuasion would have been needed to convince her that this was an offer she couldn't refuse. Of all of Caruso's many top-tier mob clients, it was obviously Joel Rostow who had most to lose if the true events of Cielo Drive came out. When Rostow was freed on bail after being shot during the failed Watson dope robbery in April '69, he'd relied on Caruso's legal services to keep him out of court. When the police interviewed Rostow about Charlene McCaffrey's claimed that her former boyfriend had dropped off a major drug delivery at Cielo Drive hours before the murders, Caruso gave him advice on how to answer any further questions. It's possible that Caruso knew about Watson's drug burglary MO. 7 months before he miraculously ended up on Sexy Sadie's legal team. The Rostow publicly represented Rostow's partner in crime, Gino Massaro, in 1968 in his very Cielo-like drug-related home invasion charge, adds even more suspicion to Caruso's defense of Atkins. Gerard Katina, the head of the Genovese family, who the Boyardos and Joel Rostow ultimately answered to, had already mounted his own private investigation into the death of Sebring and the La Biancas. Katina wanted to know who was killing off his West Coast connections, and he was more than a little curious about the huge amount of drugs that had been stolen from his LA distributors. The Genovese family maintained 1,000 eyes and ears throughout the federal prison system, including quite a few law enforcement officials in the mob's payroll. In many ways, the syndicate's intelligence operation was more effective than anything the police could arrange. So it isn't at all unlikely that the first jailhouse whispers about Atkins involved in the Tate LaBianca murders could have reached the Genovese family before they were relayed to the authorities. Whoever prompted her to squeal, by early November of '69, Sexy Sadie began to prowl the halls of the Sybil Brand Institute, eager to tell her gory tale to anyone who would listen. Knowing Manson as well as Atkins did, she would certainly have had it drummed into her that the wages of snitching on your crime partner's misdeeds was death. So what was Atkins up to with all this incautious talk about the Tate murders? By hoping that someone else would do the dirty work of informing the police of her knowledge of what occurred on Cielo Drive, Atkins was trying to snitch without being held accountable for snitching. Atkins' supposedly spontaneous confession has every appearance of being contrived subterfuge. According to convict protocol, only offering direct testimony to the authorities counts as the kind of snitching that gets you a knife in the stomach when you aren't paying attention. If Sadie admitted her participation in the Cielo Drive crimes by telling a fellow prisoner about it in supposed confidence, and that prisoner in turn betrayed her by going to the cops, Sadie couldn't technically be considered a turncoat. Furthermore, by presenting her tale in the form of enthusiastic, bloodthirsty bragging rather than remorseful squealing, Atkins hoped to suggest to a later jury that she was mentally ill. Her legal strategy from the beginning was to put on a crazy act, something she repeatedly said Charlie advised her to do if she ever ended up in jail. Atkins' willingness to blame Manson for the crimes immediately after her arrest would in itself seem to disprove the popular myth tenet that she was one of the most devoted and loyal disciples. But somehow this clear-cut contradiction is overlooked in the standard literature on the case. The story she told was very vague on motive, but decidedly didn't include a word about "I went along with Tex to steal thousands of dollars worth of mescaline, cocaine, MDA, and acid." Nor did her story mention anything like helter skelter as a motive. That important detail was only added much later as more legal cooks added to the brew. The first Sybil Brand prisoner Sadie tried to embroil in this plot was Nancy Jordan, who was in on a heroin possession charge. Atkins dropped some very broad hints about her involvement in the most infamous unsolved crimes of that time to Jordan, but Jordan didn't contact the authorities with the information. Atkins moved on to another con, Corey Hurst, but Hurst also kept Sadie's blood-soaked bragging to herself. The next prisoner Sadie set her sights on was Sharon Rosberg. Atkins didn't beat around the bush this time. She specifically told Rosberg that she had stabbed Abigail Folger at Sierra Drive, even though that wasn't true. The most peculiar aspect of Atkins' many inconsistent confessions is that she repeatedly made herself out to be much guiltier than she actually was. In fact, her entire involvement was limited to watching the panicky scene unfold as Tex's robbery plan collapsed, and in non-fatally stabbing Frykowski in the legs during a furious fight with him after he freed himself from his bonds. Atkins spent her life in prison largely because of her own self-destructive bragging, a result of her overdoing the crazy act she thought would win her freedom. Sharon Rosberg also didn't bite the felonious flower child's bait. She declined to tell the prison officials about what the loopy hippie chick everybody dismissed as crazy Sadie had blabbed to her. Grandiose boasting about one's criminal exploits on the outside is a common topic of convict conversation, so it's not surprising that the first group of convicts Atkins talked to believed that the addle-brained acid head's claims sounded like the usual time-killing jailhouse braggadocio. Hundreds of attention-seeking lunatics had already bombarded the police with their false confessions to the Tate murders, and there was no reason at first to assume that Atkins wasn't just another nut. It didn't help her credibility that she mingled her seemingly improbable admission of guilt to the Sharon Tate murder with the wild tales about the groovy time she had when some guy shot himself while she was bawling him. She raved that she got a sexual thrill from drinking the suicide's blood. Atkins also said that she wanted to release her inner beauty by putting out her own eyes and mutilating her face with a red-hot poker. Atkins turned her tall tale-telling to another inmate, Roseanne Walker, but Walker also shrugged off Sadie's grisly celebrity death name-dropping as doped-up figments of a hallucination-fried imagination. Having failed 4 times to tell a story believable enough to send a fellow jailbird scurrying to the cops to break the Tate case, it looked like this scheme would never find any takers. But then fate, or something that has been made to look just like that, brought 2 30-ish party girls into earshot of loquacious sexy Sadie. One of the convicts, who we are told Atkins supposedly confessed to in jail, was a convicted prostitute named Ronnie Howard. He reels off a long list of names. She had a lot of names, right? Although her main career was in whoring and larceny, it was for forging a prescription that brought Howard to Sybil Brand with Atkins. Atkins, whose lesbian lust earned her the jailhouse nickname the fastest tongue in the West, seduced Ronnie Howard and supposedly revealed her gory gossip during a post-cunnilingus pillow talk. Ronnie Howard has since died, murdered in 1979 in yet another of the early mysterious deaths that cut short the lives of so many enmeshed in this mystery, making it impossible to confirm her exact role in this crucial turning point in Manson's life. But I was able to speak with the other woman Atkins contrived to confide in, Howard's longtime friend Virginia Graham, aka Brown, aka Sioko, aka Lopez, aka Benedict. In fact, although Howard received much of the publicity for breaking the case, it was actually Graham to whom Atkins first told the tale. If Graham's hunch about her longtime friend is correct, then Howard's was largely repeating hearsay about what Graham told her. The relevant connections Atkins' attorney Caruso had to such Cielo Drive drug-dealing visitors as Rossdale, Harrigan, Doyle, and Reinhardt are more than enough to suggest that the Atkins confession was a calculated legal strategy meant to conceal any sign of mob drug dealing at Cielo Drive. The coincidental connection Graham revealed to me concerning her pre-1969 friendship with a host of dramatis personae relevant to Cielo Drive, including the murder house itself, speak for themselves. Understandably, these connections were not revealed in court when Graham testified. Virginia Graham's willingness to inform law enforcement about what Atkins told her was one of the most significant factors leading to Manson's indictment for murder and his later conviction. Despite this crucial role Graham played in Manson's destiny, she's only been referred to in passing in the standard literature on the case, but her part in relaying the tale that forms the kernel of the Manson myth deserves more thorough analysis than has previously been presented. Graham was in her late 30s when the results of her meeting with Susan Atkins and Sybil Brand brought her to public attention. But by early November of 1969, as we will see, she could already boast of a colourful life in the company of some of the most powerful figures in the entertainment industry and politics. During our conversation, Graham was adamant in insisting that despite the fact she once authored a book entitled The Joy of Hooking, the frequently printed allegation she was a prostitute was false. I would like to straighten one thing out, she told me. I was not a professional call girl, and that has disturbed me for a very long time. I was, if you want to call it, in the Hollywood scene, so to speak. And I used to get together and have a lot of parties, and I knew a lot of celebrities, and basically that was it. But I never personally went out on any calls for any sum of money. Now I want to make this clear, Graham continues. When I put together a lot of these parties, the guests were some very influential political, let's just say, the people. I got called from Mexico. I had a relationship, a very short one, with Miguel Ullman, the president of Mexico. According to Graham, Ullman's representatives would call her to alert her to arrange parties for dignitaries, including the owner of the influential Mexican newspaper La Reforma, and they paid me for that. So that's how I got the title of Cool Girl, so be it. It was the capacity of arranging these parties for prominent men that she first met Ronnie Howard and at the famous hooker hangout, the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel. She said that Howard would be a welcome guest at the parties because of her attractiveness at the time. Graham's hostess duties, she told me, consisted of introducing very well-to-do gentlemen with very pretty ladies, and I was certainly no Jolie Gabor, but I did much the same thing. Gabor, the Hungarian-born mother of actresses Ava and Zaza Gabor, was famed for her Hollywood matchmaking of young female beauties and male movie industry players. Graham went on to tell me I was known as a very good connection, okay? When I use the term connection, that I know a lot of people and a lot of these starlets, which I won't name who they are because some of them are quite famous now, wanted to come to these parties, and that's how I knew Ronnie. What some of these girls did when they walked out of my house, it was never an understood thing with any of these gentlemen that they were going to sleep with these girls, okay? What they did when they got out of my house, I truly don't know. I wasn't there. I made the connections. We had Dom Perignon, which used to be my favourite, and I had a big house with tennis courts and a pool. These girls ended up as starlets. That was a very common thing in Hollywood at the time. Graham's party house at 9440 Cherokee Lane, it has to be said, sounds like the early 60s version of the swinging scene that would later get wilder and druggier at J. Sebring's Eastern Drive Manor and at Cielo Drive. Which is not entirely surprising. Graham also told me she and her ex-husband, a sometimes pimp on the fringes of the showbiz who later married cool girl Ronnie Howard, had actually been given a tour of 10050 Cielo Drive by a real estate agent when the couple, who were already separated, were considering leasing the house in the early 60s. Graham and her husband ultimately chose another, more appropriate property in Benedict Canyon, but she recalled the layout very well when she heard Atkins' account of the murders. The ongoing 1969 FBI investigation into Sebring's connection with the Boyardo family's JFK airport heist examined the possibility that both Eastern Drive and Cielo Drive had been used by the mob's Hollywood branch as safe houses for decades. Graham told me that she was unaware of the property's reputation as an underworld haven. But not only did Graham know of Cielo Drive years before she ran into Sexy Sadie, she was also friendly with Jay Sebring, whose hair salon manicurist was also a close friend of hers. I asked her if she knew Sebring's receptionist, Charlene McCaffrey, but Graham said she didn't recall the name. Graham described Sebring to me as a friendly soul who she often encountered at social occasions during her nightclubbing days at such hotspots as the Luau. She recalled one of the times that the rat-packed stylist cut JFK's hair. She said among the many celebrities she was involved with, on my own choice, money was not discussed. I was available to a few, like Peter Lawford, who I don't mind naming because he's dead. Lawford, of course, was Sebring's cocaine client and friend. While Graham claimed not to know of Lawford's drug use, she described the actor as troubled with a sex problem and a drinking problem. Lawford's role in providing Sebring supplied drugs to Marilyn Monroe and his brother-in-law, Kennedy, during their secret tete-a-tetes at his home has already been mentioned. When I pointed out some of these connections, Graham confirmed that they all knew each other. Gene Shikavi I knew real well. Gene Shikavi, as mentioned in Chapter 4, was Sebring's main competitor as a hairdresser to the stars. Both men were fictionalised as the swinging 60s hairdresser George, later played by their friend Warren Beatty in the film Shampoo. The tepid sex comedy begins with an obvious reference to the Cielo Drive murders, related by a Tate-like actress character played by Goldie Hawn. According to Beatty, so close a confidant of Roman Polanski that he escorted the director from London to LA in the wake of Sharon Tate's murder, this early scene is all that remains of a much darker subplot involving a fictional dramatisation of the Cielo Drive murders, which never made it into Shampoo's final cut. Considering how many of my sources alleged that Beatty was well informed in the true nature of his friend's slaying, it would have been interesting to see how he handled one of Hollywood's touchiest topics on screen. Part of the $25,000 reward money which Sebring and Chikovi's close friend Beatty put up for information leading to an arrest in the Cielo Drive case was paid to none other than Virginia Graham. Although her stay in Sybil Brown was not connected to prostitution, Graham did admit to me that the police grilled her at the time about what she laughingly called her infamous little black book. It contained, she conceded, the names of many rich and famous men, among them the multimillionaires Kirk Kevorkian, the MGM mogul whose Las Vegas gambling ventures included the MGM Grand Hotel on the Strip, racetrack impresario John Alioso, the oil magnate Edwin Pawley. Graham told me she didn't talk about these friends of hers to the cops in 1969 and was only prepared to mention them to me now because they were long dead. MGM boss Kevorkian's legal counsel at the time was none other than the mob consigliere Sidney Korshak, Robert Evans' lawyer and patron. Metro Goldwyn Mayer's role in covering up the death of Paul Byrne for the mob in 1932 was not the end of that studio's underworld connections. And speaking of the little black books, John Alesio was well known for the business partner of a gambling czar, Frankie Carbo, whose control of Las Vegas' horse racing, according to Charlie, led to the debt Lino LaBianca owed him. But in spite of these adventures into the underworld, Graham assured me that she had been sent to the women's detention unit for nothing more sinister than violating her parole on a technicality involving a post-dated check. While she waited to be sentenced, the prison staff gave her a job delivering items to other prisoners, including notices that visitors had arrived to see them. Also assigned to this task was a flighty young thing called Miss Sadie May Glutz. In the very beginning, Graham told me, before we got into conversation heavily, I thought, who in the world is this person? She was so happy and gay, and she'd do cartwheels up and down the aisle without underwear on, you know. And this is how I got the idea it must have been drug-related. She would act silly and act like a little girl. She and I had been working together as a runner in Sybil Brand, and I asked what she was in there for. I thought it was probably drugs. 187, Atkins calmly replied. I had no idea what a 187 was, Graham recalled. Atkins went on to explain that 187 was murder. Graham hadn't heard of the little publicised Gary Hinman case Atkins had been indicted for, but she certainly knew about the bloody slayings on Cielo Drive, which Atkins gleefully boasted of carrying out. When Sexy Sadie told Virginia Graham her first version of what supposedly went down at the Polanski residence on August 9th, she happened to find someone who could imagine the setting for these events with some accuracy. I asked Graham if she could recall anything about Atkins' conversations with her that she didn't reveal in her courtroom testimony. She came down and plopped on the cot in the dormitory and just started chatting with me, Graham remembered. And she had a movie magazine, and she started to tell me there were going to be some other people they were going to kill, some celebrities and so forth. As she went on, one by one, description of who they were going to kill and how they were going to kill them, that took me back a bit, because I happened to have been intimately involved with one of the individuals she was going to murder, which was Frank Sinatra. Graham explained that it had been Sinatra, a phenomenal man, very good to me and my children, who had set her up as a Hollywood party girl in 1953. When she was working as a cocktail waitress in Lake Tahoe, she had befriended Sinatra's crony, Paul Rinaldi. When Graham came to Hollywood, Rinaldi invited her for a late-night drink at the Dom Beachcomber, a popular Hollywood cocktail lounge. When she arrived, Graham went to Rinaldi's table. A familiar voice in the dimly lit booth, she recalled, said, "Hi, babe, but when do you want to get married?" And it was Frank Sinatra, and I almost dropped dead. Graham spent her 22nd birthday on board a Nevada-bound train with Sinatra and another close friend of his, the songwriter Jimmy Van Housen, known to have acted as the sexually insatiable chairman of the board's procurer. In the same cabin on the train that night, Graham was introduced to the young Ronald Reagan, who was, she recalled, just getting over being thrown out of his first wife Jane Wyman's house. As mentioned in Chapter 4, private investigator Hal Lipset later claimed that an LAPD source told him that Jane Wyman was one of the many celebrities to be seen in the porno films confiscated from Cielo Drive after the murders. She was said to be cavorting with Greg Boutzer, a close associate of Sidney Korshak. Ronnie, she remembered, was just a lovely person. Ronnie Reagan, not Ronnie Howard. Sinatra, who Graham knew until 1961, arranged modelling jobs for her and introduced her to the circle of wealthy men for whom she had arranged her parties. This was around the same time Sinatra similarly eased Jay Sebring's entry into showbiz circles. So it's understandable that after learning that Atkins was involved in the Sharon Tate murder, this threat on her old friend Sinatra's life sent me back. With Frank Sinatra, it was just horrible, Graham recalled. And the sad thing of it was, knowing Frank as I did, she did know where he lived in Palm Springs. Now, I have no idea how she knew, but she knew, because she said that she would go up to the door and knock on the door, and when he would open the door and let her in, the rest of the crew would go in, and then she described how they would kill him. They were going to hang him on a meat hook. What bothered me, knowing him, she was the kind of pretty girl, and knocking on his door, oh boy, if Frank wouldn't have hesitated, he would have just opened it in a minute. When I asked Graham if she was certain that Atkins knew Sinatra's Palm Springs address, she confirmed that she had, and that this bit of information was what helped to encourage her to go to the authorities. According to an October the 5th, 1970 police investigation document which journalist William T. Farr obtained, Miss Atkins purportedly told Mrs. Graham, that she and her co-defendants had planned to murder a series of show business personalities, each in a particularly vicious and bizarre manner. Included in the list of intended victims were Elizabeth Taylor, whose eyes were to be removed and mailed to an ex-husband, Richard Burton, who was going to be castrated, and Frank Sinatra, who was to be skinned alive while hanging from a meat hook, and Tom Jones, whose throat was going to be cut while he was engaged in an act of sexual intercourse with Miss Atkins, at knife point if necessary. For reasons still unclear, this and other information about a celebrity death list was suppressed by Judge Charles Older during the preliminary stage of the Tate LaBianca trial. It's never been focused on, Graham mused. They never discussed that, really. It's almost like they never wanted to talk about it. Circumstances related to the Farr document eventually led to the little-known 1974 perjury trial mentioned previously. I asked Graham if Atkins mentioned any motive for wanting to kill Sinatra, and the other entertainers mentioned. She said Atkins told her, "The world has got to know," meaning that if they went ahead with these famous people, the world would know, and they would release them to the etheric, and how much they loved people. In other words, when you kill them, you had to love them. I went, holy cats. I asked Graham if she ever thought there was anything contrived or artificial about the manner of Atkins' confession to her. She had told me she knew how to play crazy and play like a little girl, was all Graham would say in response to that suggestion. After Atkins related her description of the murders that had already occurred and her plans for those that she said were to come, Graham didn't know what to do. I'm going to be called a jailhouse snitch. I'm going to be killed, she recalls thinking. I asked her how it was that both her friend Ronnie Howard and her contacted the authorities about the Atkins confession. "I'll just say this," Graham replied. "I don't want to create any more problems than there are already. I'm the one who told Ronnie originally, after Susan Atkins happened to talk to me. Ronnie happened to be in the same dorm. I hadn't seen Ronnie for years, and by that time she had married my ex-husband. And I called Ronnie to the side and I started telling her. And these were my words. I went, 'Ronnie, I can't believe that this crazy bitch, excuse my English, just told me that crazy bitch just told me she killed Sharon Tate and all this.' And she said, 'You're kidding.' And I said, 'No, I wish she hadn't told me,' she says. 'I'll meet you after count in the rec room.' I took a shower and I told her my blow by blow everything that Atkins had told me. And she goes, 'Wow, like that, what are you going to do?' And I said, 'I don't know.' And at that point at time, I had no idea. It was too much for me. A few days went by, and I still had retained somewhat of a relationship with Atkins and so forth. And so finally, they decided to violate me on my charge and send me to Corona, a more secure women's prison. When I was getting ready to leave, Ronnie asked, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know what to do at the moment. I'm not going to say anything. I'm still going to have to review this in my head." My words to her were, "If you want to pursue this, it's up to you. Go for it." Like that. And that was my last conversation with Ronnie. And the next day I went forward. Graham later learned that Ronnie Howard contacted the prison staff the same day to tell them the story about the CLO killings, which she now claimed to have heard from Atkins directly. Graham believes that while Howard may have spoken to Atkins to confirm some of the story, the bulk of what she testified about had been taken from Graham's own account of Atkins' confession. "Bugliosi put me on the stand first," Graham said. "Ronnie was sketchy. The reason I'm reluctant on this is that Ronnie's testimony would have been hearsay. I had a feeling that she might have seen something that she thought she could work out for the authorities, which I don't know if she ever did." Graham also insisted that despite her own cooperation with the police, she was given no favours and still served about 4 or 5 months in Corona prison. "I want to make this clear. I never got a deal. No one ever offered me anything." At the time of her informing on Atkins, Graham maintained she was unaware of the $25,000 reward, but she added, "Ronnie never let a buck go by herself if it was possible, and with my ex-husband, I can assure you he might have pushed it." What had finally convinced her to break her silence, Graham recalled. "I guess all this stuff sunk in as to what her future plans were. It was a very heavy burden. I tell you what I had. I was somewhat fearful by this time. I realised by this time that this young lady I was talking to was not a nut, but a murderess who was going to continue on, and I felt like if I hadn't gone forward, I would be responsible if... Listen, I had a nightmare. I couldn't sleep that finally made me go forward, because it took me a few weeks. I had a dream, and in the dream, and I told Bugliosi this, in the dream, 2 people were walking towards me. It was Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring, and they had white on, like white robes, and it was blood all over them. And they kept saying to me, 'You know what you have to do, you know what you have to do.' With that, I sat up straight in bed, and in that instant, I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I had to go forward. It was just a fluky, crazy thing," she insisted. "Vince Bugliosi told me, 'Virginia, you're either in the wrong place at the wrong time or the right place at the right time.' That's very true, and I figured out the way things have happened over the years. I was in the right place at the right time, because they were intent on murdering many, many other people." Although Graham told me she considers herself a non-religious person, she attributes this episode in her life to the intervention of a higher force. "Call it destiny, call it fate," Graham said. "And here it is 40 years later, and with Susan on her deathbed, I think I have the duty to tell you the story as it happened." My interview with Graham took place in 2008 when Atkins was still alive. She recalled that Mr. Bugliosi once said to her, "Just think, Virginia, if all the people in the world, Atkins talked to you, who knew all of these people, but that's just the way this case is." Yes, that's just the way this case is. After hearing Graham and Howard's slightly differing accounts of Atkins' statements, the police realised that details had been revealed that only someone involved in the crimes would have known. For instance, Atkins mentioned the buck knife she left behind at Cielo Drive, the clue that had been deliberately withheld from the public as a control. The fact that Atkins' story blatantly contradicted forensic evidence and the chronology of gunshots and screams heard emanating from Cielo Drive that night would have also been obvious to any of the detectives assigned to the case. But by this point in the investigation, the truth was the last thing anyone involved seemed to be concerned with. On December the 4th, 1969, approximately 4 weeks after Atkins began her extremely selective squealing to Graham, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office offered Atkins immunity from the death penalty if she would repeat her confession to a grand jury. Manson, Kasabian, Krenwinkel, Atkins, Van Houten, and Watson were indicted for the Tate LaBianca murders and publicly named as suspects. But even before her grand jury testimony had been heard, the basic outline of Atkins' confession to Graham was spread all over the world by the mass media. After being briefly questioned in October, Krenwinkel fled. Instead of going back home to Inglewood, Krenwinkel hid out in Mobile, Alabama. Krenwinkel adopted the alias of Montgomery, which was Tex Watson's mother's maiden name. Tex had long since fled to his hometown of Cokeville, Texas. There he had dropped the briefly assumed hippie look he cultivated in LA, hoping to slip unobserved back into small-town Texas life. Watson's partner in crime, Linda Kasabian, had gone underground in Massachusetts. The killer's attempts to elude capture by cutting their ties with the Manson circle doesn't fit in with the notion of them as zealous disciples of a cult who'd proudly carried out ritual murders meant to ignite a race war, On the contrary, their behaviour is typical of any run-of-the-mill criminals trying to avoid capture. Not to mention another glaringly obvious and never explained bit of illogic. Why didn't they continue killing random rich piggies until Helter Skelter actually broke out, if that was indeed their motive? And Watson, who the rapidly forming myth presented as the devil guru's most devoted right-hand follower, obviously had no intent of ever contacting his supposed master, Manson, again. But such inconsistencies were obscured by the media-generated excitement aroused by the tale which Atkins told Graham and the grand jury. The blinding quality of Manson's myth was already at work, even in this early stage in its construction. With Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian out of contact with each other, there was no way for them to coordinate their stories if they were interrogated about the murders by police. Had customary legal procedure been followed, the version of the confession Atkins told Virginia Graham would have been kept confidential, and her accomplices would never have known about it. That would have allowed the investigating detectives to note the inevitable discrepancies in their accounts, and perhaps even ascertain the truth about the drug-dealing basis of the murders, which other police detectives had already suspected since August. Along with the rest of the world, Watson, Kasabian, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten could now read all about Sexy Sadie's confession in the daily newspapers. By spreading Atkins' wildly distorted story of what happened at Cielo Drive, the mass media conveniently provided Watson, Krenwinkel, Van Houten, and Kasabian with the first draft of the script that they have followed to this day. There was no motive for the crimes but killing rich piggies. Manson made us do it. We were brainwashed, and there was certainly nothing so mundane as a drug robbery involved. Like Atkins, the four other suspects hoped that by pretending to be devotees of a cult who had followed their guru's orders to commit a series of random killings for some vague mystical/revolutionary reason, they might be judged to have been insane and spared from facing the death penalty. The scenario was certainly preferable, from a legal standpoint, than admitting the truth that they had killed rival drug dealers on their own volition while robbing them of their stash. By the time their trial began, the Melcher revenge and Beatles race war motives had been given much wide coverage in the international press. Nobody was thinking about anything as ordinary as drug dealing anymore. Furthermore, all of the defendants knew Manson well enough to confidently assume that he would be unlikely to reveal the truth about the crimes. They knew that his outlaw code of honor didn't allow him to cooperate with law enforcement, even for his own benefit. Through the silence that code demanded, Manson was forced to be a passive participant in implicitly supporting the myth his treacherous former friends created about him. At first, some of his defense attorneys later stated Manson thought that the stories Atkins and Bugliosi told were so absurd that surely no jury would fall for them anyway. We may never know to what degree the mob higher-ups among Paul Caruso's clients dictated the story that Atkins told Graham, and which was later adopted and refined by the other defendants. The end result was that Joel Rosdale's name was kept out of the courtroom and only surfaced briefly in the press. Atkins mentioned nothing of the drug dealing of Sebring and Fikowski, but as we shall see, the book that mass-marketed her confession makes explicit reference to this crucial factor, if only to dismiss it. The narcotics trafficking motive has been mentioned so often in the press in the 4 months before Atkins' indictment that to leave it unsaid would have seemed suspicious. The same deliberately misleading strategy informs other, more recent volumes on the case. Thus, the uncritical acceptance of Atkins' confession as true already helped to assure that the crucial mob connections to the Cielo and Waverley Drive victims was effectively concealed for decades. That uncomfortable truth was replaced by the fantastic myth of Manson, the vengeful cult leader, forcing his followers, via mind control, just in case there was anyone who wasn't properly indoctrinated into the mob's preferred version of events. Extraordinary measures were taken to assure they reached the widest possible audience. Judge William Keene was assigned to supervise the early phase of the trial, knowing how easy it would be to prejudice a jury by premature overexposure of the gathering evidence. Keene explicitly forbade all involved from discussing any aspect of the case to journalists, but when the gag order was promptly ignored by Susan Atkins' lawyers, Richard Caballero and Paul Caruso, Judge Keene was amazingly passive about this blatant transgression. Enter self-described journalist Lawrence Schiller, one of the more intriguing characters to appear on the Manson saga's shadowy margins. This hustler was given the task of organising the sale of the supposed Atkins confession to the world press via the LA Times on December the 14th, 1969. and was granted credit for the quickly thrown together paperback version, The Killing of Sharon Tate, published incestuously by a Times imprint on January 1970. As we shall see, the radical counterculture journalist Rolling Stone's David Dalton and Felton, who exposed the unethical nature of the Schiller affair in their 1970 article on the new Manson case, were absolutely correct when they wrote that the Times people didn't buy the confession, they wrote it word for word. Although he's credited as author, even Schiller admits he's never been a writer. He certainly didn't pen a word of the book published under his name. Although Schiller told several sources he interviewed Atkins, he was never even in the presence of the confession. It was recorded by LA Times writer Jerry Cohen, of whom more presently. Even the brief acknowledgements page is chock-a-block with the most cynical of lies. The author wishes to acknowledge the assistance of several attorneys involved in this case. While their prime concern was the best interest of their clients, without their help, this book could not have been produced. The unnamed attorneys, Caballero and Caruso and Bugliosi, who we know pulled the strings on assigning these cooperative lawyers to Atkins, could not have given less of a damn about the best interests of Susan Atkins. In fact, by cajoling her to put her name to the confession, they clearly contrived for her. They tricked her into admitting her own guilt. Furthermore, by making sure her confession reached millions long before the trial even started, they very deliberately sought to make a fair trial for their main target, Charles Manson, albeit impossible. This is the message the book strikes again and again, with such statements attributed to Atkins as, Charlie had control over everybody. I never questioned what Charlie said, I just did it. The case against Mastermind Manson is being presented to the public even before his first court appearance. We need to move to the second paragraph of the acknowledgements to find the next lie. The author wishes to acknowledge the invaluable aid of two journalists who worked with the author in preparing this book and the original interviews with Susan Atkins. Since it sure isn't Schiller, who is this mysterious author thanking? Those two helpful journalists. Actually, what's going on here in this odd case of literary masturbation is that the real author, Jerry Cohen of the Los Angeles Times, is under the guise of Schiller, thanking himself and his partner in deception, Dial Torgensen, another Times journalist who helped create the manuscript Schiller was given credit, if that's the word, for composing. Just as Ronnie Howard, complicit in the tangled journey to get the fake Atkins confession into the public's mind, was murdered in 1979, and Cohen and Torgensen also met violent ends. Cohen, beset by failing health, killed himself in 1993. 10 years earlier, his collaborator Torgensen was killed at only 55 when his car was blown up on the Honduras-Nicaragua border by a deliberately triggered landmine, while he was covering the Reagan administration's dirty war against the Sandinistas in that region. We've already covered Cohen's earlier shady Schiller operation, which found the two FBI asset informants striving to cover up the circumstances of the Kennedy assassination by smearing witnesses who wanted to testify about what they knew of the conspiracy to kill the mobbed-up Playboy president. And now here's Cohen again in 1969, working once more with Schiller to put forth more lies to conceal the truth about yet another mysterious mob-ridden case. What's more, revealing just how rotten the trial was from its inception. Cohen was a close associate of Vincent Bugliosi. The Times newshound began working as a ghostwriter for the never-completed true crime book with the ambitious attorney a full 2 or 3 years before the more lucrative Manson case occupied their attention. Cohen, writing in a voice attributed to Schiller, also tells the lie in The Killing of Sharon Tate that Schiller would be the last newsman to be granted access to the snitchy Sadie before her trial. What actually happened was that Cohen holed himself up in Schiller's den and churned out the supposed confession of Susan Atkins in a record-breaking 2 days of hasty hack work. You can tell. That Bugliosi played a secret role in the scam was practically admitted by Schiller, who was all but a wink, told Newsweek, let's say this, the prosecution didn't put up any obstacles. And why would they? The killing of Sharon Tate is quite literally the defense doing the prosecution's work for them. Cohen, in his Schiller voice, pads the first part of the swiftly scribbled paperback with pages of trite pontificating filler, essentially characterizing the Tate LaBianca murders as the inevitable progression of hippies, LSD, Haight-Ashbury, and Timothy Leary. The narrative voice tells us that Charles Manson was one of the satanic mind-benders in the Haight. The false occult angle Ed Sanders would later run with is invoked without providing the slightest evidence that there was anything satanic about Manson. We learn of this diabolical character's Rasputin-like grip on his followers. Strangely, considering the fact that one of the chief points of the cover-up as it develops was to insist that the victims were strangers to the culprits, Cohen inexplicably comes close to spilling the beans about the truth in the first few pages. He writes coyly, "Rich hippies, poor hippies, the beautiful people, the dregs of Haight-Ashbury, they were in and around Hollywood at the same time. One wonders, did their paths ever cross? The Manson family and the Polanski coterie? Police say they didn't." Cohen compares Polanski to Manson, painting them both as leaders of their own entourages, even claiming that while Polanski wasn't satanic, he had some interest in the black arts. He didn't. Cohen brings up loose talk about Sebring's sexual proclivities without specifying his insinuation signifies, and acknowledges that it is known that he used drugs. Frykowski is described as a heavy narcotics user hooked on cocaine, but had begun to experiment with far-out combinations of drugs that frightened even his friends. Folger, he writes with surprising accuracy, became a heavy drug user herself. Describing the Polanski living room, Cohen and Schiller presumes that the latter was placed in the much-discussed loft to provide a spectator platform for those who chose to watch rather than participate in the rumoured fun and games that went on below. After all this, Cohen's admission that Manson was going to some of Hollywood's plushest parties comes off as a tacit confirmation that indeed the Haight-Ashbury dregs crossed paths with the beautiful people on friendlier terms than the bloody mess Tex left behind on his last visit would indicate. Cohen Schiller wonders rhetorically if the seeds of the slaughter may be found in the sexual excess, revenge, and drug trafficking. Yes, yes, and yes. Page 38 of the book already finds Cohen touch on the truth. Atkins finally admitted during the penalty phase of her trial, in the form of speculative questions, both Frykowski and Sebring were heavy narcotics users. Were they also dealers, as some people speculated, and had one or the other pulled a double cross? He even brings up the reports in the press about Whittle K's claims to the police that the killings were drug-related, but dismisses his suspicions as merely one of the endless blind leads which police chased down. On page 41, the truth is touched on again, only to be waved aside as just another false lead. Speculation continued to centre on the likelihood of the Polish playboys having been the prime target of the Benedict Canyon massacre because of his suspected involvement with drug traffickers. Cohen amusingly praises some of his own earlier Times articles about the murders without mentioning that he's their author. Ultimately, when it comes to the motive, Cohen as Schiller is vague, setting the stage for Ed Sanders' ooh to come. It was a satanic whim which sent these people into Benedict Canyon. Charlie, we are assumed, gave his orders. The relatively brief chapter of the book, purporting to be a transcript of Atkins' supposed confession, is surely based on some of her words, but it's obviously funneled through Cohen and or Torgenson's two-day ghostwriting prism. Atkins is ultimately vaguely quoted as saying that the motive was both to instill fear in Terry Melcher, because Terry had given his word on a few things and had never come through with them, and while they were at it, to instill fear in man himself, man, the establishment. That's what it was done for, to instill fear and to cause paranoia. Nothing about freeing Bobby. Certainly nothing about Linda's avenging Wojtek's drug burn. No bottomless pits, no Beatles, no intricate plan to take over the world after the racial Armageddon. Atkins later forcefully denied that Bugliosi's helter-skelter motive was in any way valid. But one blink and you'll miss it quote attributed to her is the first early whisper of the race war motive to come. A conceit confined to a single sentence referring to the murders as having been executed to also show the black man how to go about taking over white man. Atkins claimed she threw the hand towel over Sebring's head, although Charlie later copped to throwing in the towel when he went to the crime scene after the slaying was over. Atkins also recalls that while she waited in the car outside the LaBianca's house while Manson and Watson were inside, she fell asleep, seeing what was going on inside through the medium of a remote viewing dream. Upon arriving at Waverley, she also says she asked Charlie, "Isn't that the house we took acid in?" When he corrects her, saying it was the true house next door, she adds that Charlie would have picked it to instill a lot of fear in them, because they had just totally blanked out on us. They were people who had given us their word and then backed out of it, like Terry Melcher. Jerry Cohen's friend and collaborator, Vincent Bugliosi, the eminence grise hovering in the background of the book's composition, weren't quite figured out the details of the more elaborate fiction he was preparing to present in court some 6 months later. And yet the mostly forgotten killing of Sharon Tate is really Helter Skelter's first draft. The mendacious legal gambit disguised as a book not only set the stage for convicting Manson before his trial, in many ways it set the prototype of almost all Manson literature to